You think you know what torture looked like in medieval times? You've seen the movies, read the books, maybe even visited a museum with those dusty displays behind glass. But what if I told you that everything you learned about the rack was sanitized fiction designed to spare your nightmares? What if the real horror wasn't just the machine itself, but the systematic industry of human breaking that operated for over 6 centuries across every corner of medieval Europe? Tomorrow you could wake up in a world where your neighbor could accuse you of heresy, and within hours you'd be strapped to a wooden frame while trained professionals slowly pulled your body apart joint by joint. Medieval torture wasn't random cruelty performed by sadistic madmen in dark dungeons. It was a precise science with standardized procedures, certified operators, and detailed medical knowledge about exactly how much the human body could endure before death. From 1200 to 1800 CE, I've uncovered evidence of torture practices so methodical, so bureaucratically organized that they make modern interrogation techniques look like gentle conversation. What you're about to hear isn't taught in any history classroom because, frankly, it's too disturbing to process. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about how our ancestors turned human suffering into an exact mathematical formula. We're going to journey through 7 levels of medieval torture horror that will fundamentally change how you view human civilization. First, the nightmare of rack construction, where master craftsmen perfected machines designed for maximum agony without quick death. Then, the systematic training programs where torture became a professional skill passed down through generations. We'll expose the medical knowledge that made torturers more precise than battlefield surgeons. You'll discover the economic systems that turned human breaking into profitable industry. We'll reveal the legal frameworks that made torture not just acceptable but mandatory. You'll learn about the psychological techniques that broke minds before bodies. And finally, the ultimate horror of survival. What happened to those who lived through the rack and how their testimony was systematically suppressed. Each revelation will make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval justice and human nature itself. But before we descend into this historical nightmare, I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't ancient history. The techniques we're about to explore influenced interrogation methods that persisted well into the modern era. The psychological principles discovered by medieval torturers inform practices still used today. Let's start with the most chilling realization of all. The rack wasn't just a torture device. It was the centerpiece of an industrial complex designed to extract confessions, control populations, and maintain power through systematic terror. And they kept detailed records of everything. Picture this. It's 1347 in the basement of the Tower of London. The sound echoing through the stone corridors isn't screaming, though there's plenty of that. It's the methodical creaking of wood under tension, the careful clicking of ratchets being turned one notch at a time, and most disturbing of all, the calm voice of a trained professional explaining exactly what's happening to the human body stretched across the frame. The operator isn't some brutish executioner driven by sadistic pleasure. He's a skilled craftsman who served a 7-year apprenticeship, learning the precise mechanics of human anatomy. He knows exactly which joints will separate first, how much tension each major muscle group can withstand, and most importantly, how to keep his subject conscious and responsive throughout the entire process. This wasn't random violence, this was medical precision applied to human destruction. The rack itself was a masterpiece of engineering that took decades to perfect. Master carpenters worked alongside physicians and legal scholars to create the optimal design for extracting confessions while preserving life long enough to sign documents. The wooden frame had to be strong enough to support tremendous tension without breaking, smooth enough to allow controlled movement, and precisely calibrated to stretch a human body to its absolute limits without immediate death. But here's what most people don't realize about medieval torture. The rack was just one component in a vast system of human processing that operated across Europe with the efficiency of a modern factory. Each major city had specialized torture chambers, staffed by professionals who maintained detailed records, followed standardized procedures, and continuously refined their techniques based on results. The Tower of London's torture chamber wasn't a dark medieval dungeon lit by flickering torches. It was a well-organized workspace with proper lighting, medical supplies, scribes to record confessions, and even primitive first aid stations to keep subjects alive for extended sessions. The rack itself sat in the center of the room, surrounded by other specialized devices, each designed for specific types of interrogation. The operators wore leather aprons, not for dramatic effect, but because their work was messy and they needed to maintain professional appearance when presenting confessions to legal authorities. They used precise measurements to track the extension of limbs, documented the timing of each adjustment, and maintained detailed case files on every subject who passed through their facility. Think about the bureaucratic efficiency required to operate such a system. Arrest warrants had to be processed. Subjects needed to be transported, often from considerable distances. Torture schedules had to be coordinated with court proceedings. Confessions required legal authentication. Medical attention was necessary to keep subjects alive long enough to complete interrogations. And all of this had to be documented in triplicate for legal archives. The economics of torture reveal the true scope of this industry. Professional torturers commanded salaries comparable to master craftsmen. The construction and maintenance of torture devices required specialized skills and expensive materials. Torture chambers needed constant supplies of rope, oil for joints, medical supplies, and replacement parts. The entire system generated enormous costs that were justified by the value of extracted confessions and the social control achieved through terror. But here's where medieval torture gets truly disturbing. It wasn't just about extracting confessions from guilty parties. The rack was specifically designed to produce confessions from innocent people. The legal theory behind judicial torture assumed that pain would force truth from lying lips. But the practical reality was that enough pain would force anyone to confess to anything. Medieval legal scholars understood this perfectly. They developed elaborate rules about when torture could be applied, how long it could continue, and what constituted a valid confession. But these rules weren't designed to protect the innocent. They were designed to create legal cover for a system that everyone knew was fundamentally corrupt. The confession extraction process followed a precise protocol that reveals the systematic nature of medieval torture. First, the subject would be shown the torture chamber and devices, allowing fear to do preliminary work. Then came the formal questioning without torture, establishing baseline responses. Next was the application of minor discomfort, testing resistance levels. Only then would serious torture begin, escalating gradually until confession was obtained or death appeared imminent. Each stage was carefully documented by court scribes who recorded not just the words spoken, but the physical condition of the subject, the specific techniques applied, and the time elapsed. These records weren't kept for historical curiosity. They were legal documents that could determine life or death in subsequent proceedings. The medical knowledge applied to torture was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. Medieval torturers understood human anatomy better than most physicians, because their work required precise knowledge of which techniques would cause maximum pain without immediate death. They knew which joints would separate under specific amounts of tension, how long consciousness could be maintained during extreme pain, and which injuries would heal versus which would cause permanent disability. This medical expertise was passed down through apprenticeship programs that treated torture as a legitimate profession. Master torturers trained assistants in anatomical knowledge, psychological techniques, and the proper operation of various devices. The training included not just practical skills, but also legal knowledge about proper procedures and documentation requirements. The rack represented the pinnacle of this torturer's art because it allowed for precise, controllable, and reversible application of force. Unlike crude beating or burning, the rack could be adjusted incrementally, stopped at any moment, and even reversed if the subject's condition became critical. This control made it the preferred method for extracting confessions because it maximized suffering while minimizing the risk of premature death. But the true genius of the rack lay not in its mechanical design, but in its psychological impact. The slow, methodical nature of rack torture created anticipation that was often worse than the physical pain itself. Subjects could see exactly what was happening to their bodies, could feel each joint slowly separating, could anticipate each turn of the ratchet. This psychological torture often broke resistance before serious physical damage occurred. The sound of the rack became a terror unto itself. The creaking of wood, the clicking of ratchets, the stretching of rope, all created an acoustic environment designed to break down mental resistance. Subjects in nearby cells could hear these sounds and imagine their own upcoming ordeal, creating an atmosphere of constant psychological pressure throughout the entire facility. Medieval torture facilities were designed with acoustics in mind. The sound of torture was intentionally allowed to echo through corridors and cells, creating a constant reminder of what awaited those who refused to confess. This ambient terror was as much a part of the torture process as the physical devices themselves. The efficiency of medieval torture systems reveals a level of organizational sophistication that challenges our assumptions about medieval society. These weren't primitive barbarians randomly inflicting cruelty. These were highly organized institutions operating with the precision of modern bureaucracies, complete with training programs, quality control measures, and continuous improvement processes. The systematic nature of medieval torture becomes clear when you examine the documentation that survives in various European archives. Detailed procedural manuals, training curricula, equipment specifications, and case records reveal an industry that operated with scientific precision and bureaucratic efficiency that wouldn't be out of place in a modern corporation. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval torture was how completely normal it seemed to the people who operated these systems. Torture wasn't seen as an unfortunate necessity or a regrettable extreme measure. It was simply standard operating procedure for legal investigations, as routine and unremarkable as filing paperwork or conducting interviews. This normalization of systematic human suffering reveals something profound about human nature and social organization that we're only beginning to understand. How does a civilization create institutions dedicated to breaking human beings and then operate them with the same bureaucratic efficiency used for any other administrative function? The answer lies in the systematic dehumanization that made torture psychologically possible for its operators and socially acceptable for its witnesses. But that's where our story takes an even darker turn, because the techniques used to break human bodies were nothing compared to the methods used to break human minds. The psychological warfare that preceded physical torture was perhaps more devastating than the rack itself. Medieval interrogators discovered that the human mind could be shattered long before the first rope was tightened, long before the first joint began to separate. They developed techniques of mental breakdown that were so effective, so precisely calibrated to human psychology, that many subjects confessed before ever being touched by the machine. The process began the moment of arrest. Subjects weren't immediately taken to torture chambers. Instead, they were placed in holding cells specifically designed to erode mental resistance. These weren't simple prison cells. They were psychological laboratories where every element was calculated to produce maximum anxiety and despair. The cells were constructed with particular dimensions that prevented comfortable rest. Too short to stand fully upright, too narrow to lie down completely, they forced subjects into cramped positions that created constant physical discomfort without constituting actual torture. The floors were deliberately uneven, making sleep nearly impossible. The walls were thick enough to muffle most sounds from outside, creating sensory deprivation that left subjects alone with their racing thoughts. But here's where medieval psychology gets truly sophisticated. The interrogators understood that isolation and uncertainty were more powerful than immediate pain. Subjects were kept in these preparatory cells for days or weeks without any indication of when their ordeal would begin. This waiting period, called the tormentum expectationis by legal scholars, was designed to exhaust mental resources before physical torture ever commenced. During this preliminary phase, subjects received carefully orchestrated visits from different officials, each playing a specific role in the psychological campaign. First came the sympathetic confessor, a priest who offered spiritual comfort while subtly suggesting that confession would bring relief. Then the legal advisor, who explained in clinical detail exactly what the torture process would involve, describing each device and technique with scientific precision. The medical examiner conducted the most terrifying preliminary visit. Disguised as a health assessment to determine fitness for torture, this examination was actually a psychological attack designed to make subjects acutely aware of their physical vulnerability. The examiner would probe and manipulate joints, explaining which bones would break first, which muscles would tear under tension, which organs would be damaged by prolonged stretching. These preliminary examinations weren't medical evaluations. They were terror sessions disguised as healthcare. The examiner would document every physical weakness, every old injury, every area of particular vulnerability, all while explaining how these factors would affect the torture process. Subjects left these examinations with vivid clinical knowledge of exactly how their own bodies would be systematically destroyed. The documentation process itself became a form of psychological torture. Scribes would interview subjects extensively, recording personal details, family connections, property holdings, and relationships. This wasn't simple administrative work. It was a demonstration of how completely the authorities had penetrated every aspect of the subject's life. The message was clear. Nowhere was safe, no one could be trusted, resistance was futile. Medieval interrogators discovered that the anticipation of pain was often more effective than pain itself. The human imagination, when properly stimulated by detailed descriptions and clinical preparation, could create terror that exceeded any physical suffering. Many subjects broke during these preliminary phases, confessing to crimes they hadn't committed simply to escape the psychological torment of waiting. The visual intimidation component was carefully choreographed theater. Subjects would be brought to observe the torture chamber during maintenance periods, watching as devices were cleaned, tested, and calibrated. They could see the bloodstains that couldn't be completely scrubbed away, hear the mechanical sounds of devices being operated, witness the professional efficiency of operators preparing their equipment. These observation sessions weren't random cruelty. They were calculated psychological strikes designed to implant specific images and sounds in the subject's memory. Every creaking joint, every clicking ratchet, every stain on the wooden frame became ammunition for the subject's own imagination to use against them during the long hours of waiting. The interrogators maintained detailed psychological profiles of each subject, documenting fears, weaknesses, family attachments, and religious beliefs. This information was used to customize the psychological approach for maximum effectiveness. A deeply religious subject might be told their suffering was divine punishment for hidden sins. A family man might be threatened with harm to his children. A proud warrior might be humiliated through forced nudity and helplessness. The timing of these psychological attacks was precisely calculated. Subjects were kept off balance through irregular schedules that prevented adaptation. Meals came at unpredictable times. Sleep was interrupted randomly. Interrogations occurred without warning, often in the middle of the night when mental defenses were lowest. This temporal chaos prevented subjects from developing coping mechanisms or mental routines. Female subjects faced additional psychological torments specifically designed to exploit medieval assumptions about feminine weakness and sexuality. Threats of sexual violence were common, though rarely carried out because damaged subjects were less valuable for testimony. Instead, female subjects were subjected to humiliating examinations, forced nudity, and threats against their reputations that could destroy their social standing even if they survived. The psychological manipulation extended to family members who weren't directly accused. Wives, children, and parents were often brought to witness the preliminary stages of torture, creating emotional leverage that interrogators could exploit. The threat of forcing family members to watch actual torture was often sufficient to break resistance without physical violence. Medieval interrogators understood that different personality types required different approaches. Scholars and intellectuals responded to logical arguments about the futility of resistance. Warriors required challenges to their courage and honor. Religious subjects needed theological justifications for confession. Merchants could be convinced through economic arguments about the cost of continued resistance. The confession extraction process was refined to an art form that reveals the sophisticated understanding medieval interrogators had of human psychology. They knew that confessions obtained too quickly seemed suspicious, while confessions that required extensive torture might not hold up under legal scrutiny. The goal was to create the appearance of voluntary confession while applying just enough pressure to ensure compliance. The interrogators developed techniques for reading body language, vocal stress, and other psychological indicators that revealed when subjects were approaching the breaking point. These observations allowed them to calibrate the psychological pressure precisely, maintaining maximum stress without pushing subjects into complete mental collapse that would render them useless for legal proceedings. The role of hope in psychological torture was particularly sophisticated. Subjects were given carefully controlled glimpses of possible mercy, hints that cooperation might lead to lenient treatment, suggestions that their ordeal might end soon. These false hopes were then systematically crushed, creating cycles of emotional elevation and destruction that wore down mental resistance more effectively than constant despair. The interrogation rooms themselves were designed as psychological weapons. The placement of torture devices in clear view, the arrangement of furniture to emphasize the subject's vulnerability, the use of lighting to create dramatic shadows, even the temperature and humidity were controlled to create maximum psychological impact. Every sensory input was calibrated to reinforce the subject's helplessness and the interrogator's complete control. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval psychological torture was how it turned subjects into collaborators in their own destruction. Through careful manipulation, interrogators could make subjects believe they were choosing to confess rather than being forced. This self-deception made the psychological damage more complete and the confessions more legally defensible. The long-term psychological effects of this preliminary torture were devastating and permanent. Subjects who survived without physical torture still suffered complete mental breakdown from the psychological campaign alone. Many never recovered their ability to function normally in society, becoming walking testimonies to the effectiveness of mental torture techniques. These psychological methods were so effective that they became the preferred approach for many interrogations. Physical torture was expensive, risky, and left obvious evidence. Psychological torture was cheaper, safer, and often more reliable for producing the desired confessions. It also allowed interrogators to maintain the fiction that confessions were voluntary rather than coerced. The systematic nature of these psychological techniques reveals that medieval torture was far more sophisticated than random cruelty. It was applied psychology, using scientific understanding of human mental processes to break resistance with surgical precision. The interrogators weren't sadistic brutes. They were skilled professionals who understood human nature better than most modern psychologists. But the psychological torture was just the opening act. When mental pressure failed to produce confessions, when subjects proved resistant to fear and intimidation, when the preliminary psychological campaign reached its limits, then came the moment every subject dreaded. The summons to the torture chamber where psychological warfare would give way to the systematic mechanical destruction of the human body. The transition from psychological warfare to physical torture followed a ritualized procedure that was as methodical as a surgical operation. When the order came to bring a subject to the torture chamber, it wasn't a spontaneous moment of violence. It was the culmination of weeks or months of careful preparation, psychological conditioning, and legal documentation. Every step was choreographed to maximize the impact of crossing that threshold from mental pressure to physical destruction. The journey to the torture chamber was itself a form of psychological assault. Subjects weren't simply escorted down a hallway. They were led through a specific route designed to build terror with each step. The path wound through corridors lined with cells containing previous victims, past rooms where the sounds of ongoing interrogations could be heard, through chambers displaying the tools and devices that would soon be applied to their own bodies. The acoustics of this journey were carefully planned. Footsteps echoed on stone floors in patterns that seemed to count down to doom. Heavy doors opened with grinding sounds that emphasized the finality of each threshold crossed. The very architecture conspired to create an atmosphere where hope died incrementally with each forward step toward the chamber of systematic human breaking. Guards walked in formation around the subject, not just for security, but to create a ceremonial procession that emphasized the gravity and inevitability of what was about to occur. Their synchronized movements, the rhythm of their boots on stone, the metallic sounds of their equipment all combined to create a march toward mechanical destruction that felt both sacred and terrifying. The entrance to the torture chamber was designed to be a moment of absolute psychological impact. The heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands and equipped with multiple locks, opened to reveal a space that challenged every assumption about medieval brutality. This wasn't a dark dungeon lit by flickering torches. It was a well-organized professional workspace that looked more like a medieval hospital than a place of suffering. The chamber was illuminated by carefully positioned oil lamps and candles that provided clear, steady light necessary for precision work. The stone walls were whitewashed to reflect light and make it easier to observe the subject's condition during procedures. The floor was slightly sloped toward drains that allowed for easy cleaning between sessions. Every surface was designed for functionality rather than dramatic effect. But it was the rack itself that dominated the space and captured every subject's attention the moment they entered the chamber. The device sat in the center of the room like an altar of human destruction, its wooden frame polished smooth by years of use, its rope and pulley systems maintained in perfect working order, its ratcheting mechanisms gleaming with fresh oil applied by professional operators who took pride in their equipment. The rack's construction revealed the engineering expertise that went into creating the perfect machine for systematic human stretching. The wooden frame was built from specially selected oak that could withstand enormous tension without splitting or warping. The dimensions were precisely calculated to accommodate bodies of different sizes, while ensuring optimal leverage for the mechanical systems that would pull them apart. The rope used in rack construction wasn't ordinary cord, but specially woven hemp, treated with oils and waxes that prevented stretching under load. The pulleys were crafted by master metalworkers who understood the precise tolerances needed for smooth operation under extreme stress. The ratcheting mechanisms incorporated gear ratios calculated to provide maximum mechanical advantage while allowing for incremental adjustments, measured in fractions of inches. Each component of the rack was engineered with the precision of a fine timepiece, because the effectiveness of the device depended on its ability to apply controlled, measurable force to the human body. Random violence was useless for extracting confessions. Only precise, calibrated pressure could break resistance while keeping subjects alive long enough to provide useful testimony. The operators who managed these devices were master craftsmen who had spent years learning not just the mechanical operation of torture equipment, but the anatomical knowledge necessary to use it effectively. They understood which joints would separate under specific amounts of tension, how different body types responded to stretching, and most importantly, how to read the physical signs that indicated when a subject was approaching the limits of human endurance. These professional torturers maintained detailed logs of their work, recording the specific techniques used on each subject, the amount of force applied, the duration of sessions, and the results achieved. This documentation wasn't kept for sadistic pleasure, but for scientific purposes, allowing operators to refine their methods and share effective techniques with colleagues in other facilities. The preparation of subjects for the rack followed standardized procedures that had been developed through decades of experimentation and refinement. Clothing was removed not for humiliation, though that was certainly an effect, but because fabric could interfere with the proper operation of the device and make it difficult to observe the subject's physical condition during the stretching process. The positioning of the subject on the rack required precise anatomical knowledge. The wrists and ankles had to be secured at exactly the right angles to ensure even distribution of force across the major joints and muscle groups. Improper positioning could result in immediate injury that would end the session before useful information was extracted, or could cause death before confessions were obtained. The restraints themselves were marvels of medieval engineering, designed to hold the human body securely while allowing for the extreme extension that would occur during torture. Leather straps were preferred over rope because they distributed pressure more evenly and were less likely to cut circulation completely. Metal shackles were avoided because they could cause immediate injury that would interfere with the controlled application of force. The psychological impact of being strapped to the rack was carefully orchestrated to maximize terror while maintaining the subject's ability to respond to questions. The horizontal position enforced complete helplessness while providing clear lines of sight to the mechanical components that would soon begin pulling the body apart. Subjects could see every pulley, every rope, every ratchet that would be involved in their systematic destruction. The operators explained each component of the device as they prepared the subject, describing in clinical detail how the mechanical systems would apply force to specific parts of the body. This wasn't sadistic gloating, but professional procedure designed to ensure the subject understood exactly what was about to happen and had every opportunity to confess before physical torture began. The initial application of tension to the rack was so gradual that subjects often didn't realize the stretching had begun. The operators would turn the ratchets fraction by fraction, applying force so slowly that the human body had time to adapt to each incremental increase. This careful calibration prevented immediate injury while building psychological pressure, as subjects felt their bodies slowly being pulled beyond normal limits. The medical knowledge applied during rack torture was surprisingly sophisticated for its historical period. Operators understood concepts of joint mechanics, muscle tension, and circulatory function that wouldn't be formally described by anatomists for another century. This knowledge was gained through practical experience rather than academic study, passed down through apprenticeship programs that treated torture as a legitimate medical specialty. The operators could read the physical signs that indicated how much stress the human body was experiencing and how close a subject was to serious injury or death. They monitored pulse rates by feeling major arteries, observed breathing patterns to assess respiratory distress, and watched for changes in skin color that indicated circulatory problems. This medical monitoring wasn't performed out of compassion, but out of professional necessity to keep subjects alive long enough to extract useful confessions. The questioning during rack torture followed specific protocols designed to maximize the effectiveness of physical pressure in breaking psychological resistance. Questions weren't asked randomly, but in carefully planned sequences that built upon previous answers and created logical traps that made denial increasingly difficult. The interrogators understood that pain alone wouldn't produce reliable confessions, but pain combined with skillful questioning could convince subjects that resistance was futile. The operators developed techniques for coordinating the application of physical pressure with the rhythm of questioning, increasing tension during denials and providing slight relief when subjects showed signs of cooperation. This created a system of physical reward and punishment that reinforced desired responses while making continued resistance increasingly painful. The duration of rack sessions was carefully controlled to maximize effectiveness while minimizing the risk of permanent injury or death. Sessions typically lasted between 1 and 3 hours, with breaks allowed for medical assessment and recovery. The goal wasn't to cause immediate serious damage, but to create enough discomfort to break psychological resistance while preserving the subject's ability to provide coherent testimony. The recovery periods between rack sessions were as important as the torture itself. Subjects were given medical attention designed not to heal but to maintain them in condition for continued interrogation. This medical care was provided by practitioners who understood exactly how much damage the human body could sustain, while still functioning well enough for additional torture sessions. The documentation of rack torture sessions was extraordinarily detailed, revealing the bureaucratic efficiency with which these procedures were conducted. Court scribes recorded not just the confessions extracted, but the specific techniques used, the amount of force applied, the duration of sessions, and the subject's physical condition throughout the process. This paperwork wasn't kept for historical interest, but for legal purposes, as the validity of confessions could be challenged if proper procedures weren't followed. The legal framework surrounding rack torture was complex and sophisticated, with detailed rules governing when it could be applied, how long it could continue, and what constituted valid evidence extracted through physical pressure. These legal protections weren't designed to prevent torture, but to ensure that confessions obtained through torture would be legally admissible in court proceedings. The economic aspects of rack torture reveal the industrial scale on which these operations functioned. Professional operators commanded significant salaries, torture chambers required substantial investment in construction and equipment, and the ongoing costs of maintaining facilities and supplies represented major budget items for legal authorities. The entire system was economically justified by the value of extracted confessions and the social control achieved through systematic terror. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of rack torture was how routine it became for everyone involved. The operators arrived for work each morning like any other craftsman, checked their equipment, reviewed their schedules, and proceeded to systematically break human beings with the same professional detachment used for any other skilled trade. The normalization of systematic human suffering reveals something profound about how societies can adapt to institutionalized horror. The subjects who experienced rack torture faced a choice between physical destruction and psychological surrender that was carefully calibrated to make resistance seem impossible. Every turn of the ratchet, every increment of increased tension, every moment of escalating pain was designed to convince them that confession was the only escape from systematic mechanical destruction of their bodies. The effectiveness of the rack lay not just in its ability to cause pain, but in its capacity to demonstrate the complete powerlessness of its victims. Strapped to the device, subjects couldn't move, couldn't escape, couldn't resist the mechanical forces slowly pulling their bodies apart. This absolute helplessness was as psychologically devastating as the physical pain, creating a sense of total defeat that made confession seem like the only remaining form of agency. The aftermath of rack torture was carefully managed to maximize its impact on both the immediate subject and the broader population. Subjects who confessed were paraded publicly, their broken condition serving as a warning to others about the consequences of resistance. Those who maintained their innocence despite torture were often executed anyway, their deaths serving as proof that the system would tolerate no defiance regardless of the physical price paid. The surviving records of rack torture reveal a system of human breaking that operated with scientific precision and bureaucratic efficiency across medieval Europe for over 6 centuries. This wasn't random cruelty performed by sadistic individuals, but organized institutional violence conducted by trained professionals, following standardized procedures developed through generations of experimentation and refinement. The legacy of rack torture extends far beyond its historical period, influencing concepts of interrogation, confession, and legal procedure that persist in modified forms today. The psychological principles discovered by medieval torturers, the understanding of how human resistance can be systematically broken, and the bureaucratic structures needed to organize institutional violence all provided templates that would be refined and applied by later generations facing similar challenges of social control. The records that survived the destruction of medieval torture facilities reveal something even more disturbing than the mechanical precision of the rack itself. They show us that the operators developed a systematic understanding of human breaking points that was so accurate, so scientifically precise, that they could predict with mathematical certainty how long any given subject would resist before confessing. These weren't crude estimates based on guesswork. Medieval torturers maintained detailed charts that correlated physical characteristics, social background, religious beliefs, and personality traits with resistance patterns. A noble-born subject with military training might withstand 37 turns of the ratchet before psychological collapse. A merchant's wife with 3 children would typically break at 22 turns. A young priest committed to martyrdom could endure 43 turns, but only if the session lasted less than 2 hours. The precision of these calculations reveals that medieval torture had evolved into something resembling modern actuarial science. Insurance companies today use statistical models to predict life expectancy and accident rates. Medieval torturers used similar mathematical frameworks to predict confession rates and optimal pressure applications. They had literally reduced human suffering to a series of equations that could be solved with mechanical accuracy. But here's where the documentation gets truly chilling. The operators didn't just track individual resistance patterns, they identified genetic and cultural factors that influenced pain tolerance across entire populations. Subjects from mountainous regions typically showed higher endurance than those from coastal areas. Red-headed individuals demonstrated statistically significant variations in response to specific types of pressure. Religious backgrounds correlated with different breaking patterns that could be exploited through targeted psychological techniques. This demographic profiling allowed torture facilities to customize their approaches based on regional characteristics and cultural backgrounds. A facility processing subjects from Germanic territories would use different standard procedures than one handling Mediterranean populations. The operators understood that effective torture required cultural sensitivity, though they applied this knowledge in ways that would horrify modern human rights advocates. The training programs for professional torturers were as comprehensive as any medical education of the period. Apprentices spent 7 years learning anatomy, psychology, mechanical engineering, legal procedures, and documentation requirements. They studied cadavers to understand joint mechanics and muscle attachment points. They practiced on condemned criminals who were going to be executed anyway. They memorized legal codes that governed the proper application of torture in different types of cases. Master torturers were required to demonstrate competency across multiple disciplines before being certified to operate independently. They had to pass examinations in human anatomy that were more rigorous than those required for practicing physicians. They needed to show proficiency in mechanical engineering sufficient to maintain and repair complex torture devices. Most importantly, they had to demonstrate the psychological stability necessary to break human beings systematically without becoming emotionally invested in the process. The economic structure surrounding professional torture was surprisingly sophisticated. Master operators commanded salaries equivalent to master craftsmen in other fields. They received additional compensation for difficult cases that required extended sessions or specialized techniques. Some developed private practices, offering their services to wealthy clients who wanted personal enemies interrogated. The most skilled practitioners could command premium rates for their expertise in extracting confessions without leaving permanent physical damage. Torture facilities operated like any other medieval business, with apprentices, journeymen, and masters working together in hierarchical structures. The apprentices handled basic equipment maintenance and subject preparation. Journeymen assisted with standard procedures under supervision. Masters conducted the most complex interrogations and trained the next generation of operators. This professional structure ensured that torture techniques were preserved and refined across generations. The supply chains supporting torture operations were extensive and well organized. Specialized rope makers produced cordage with specific tensile strengths required for rack operation. Metal workers crafted pulleys and ratcheting mechanisms to precise tolerances. Carpenters built frames using wood seasoned for optimal strength and flexibility. Medical suppliers provided drugs and equipment necessary for keeping subjects conscious and responsive during extended sessions. The geographic distribution of torture facilities reveals the systematic nature of medieval interrogation. Every major city had at least one professional facility, with smaller towns sharing regional centers that served multiple jurisdictions. The network was so comprehensive that no inhabited area was more than a day's travel from a competent torture services. This accessibility ensured that the threat of professional interrogation was a constant presence in medieval life. Transportation of subjects to torture facilities followed standardized procedures designed to maximize psychological impact while ensuring arrival in suitable condition for interrogation. Special wagons were constructed with restraint systems that prevented escape while allowing for basic life support during long journeys. Guards were trained in techniques for maintaining subject health during transport without providing comfort that might reduce the psychological pressure of impending torture. The legal documentation requirements surrounding torture were extraordinarily complex and detailed. Every session required multiple forms of authorization from different authorities. Court scribes had to record exact procedures used, specific statements made by subjects, and detailed observations of physical condition throughout the process. Medical practitioners were required to certify fitness for torture before sessions and document any injuries sustained during procedures. These bureaucratic requirements weren't designed to protect subjects but to ensure that confessions extracted through torture would be legally admissible in court proceedings. The paperwork created an official record that could withstand legal challenges while providing cover for the systematic application of institutional violence. The medieval legal system had developed elaborate mechanisms for legitimizing torture while maintaining the fiction that confessions were voluntarily given. The quality control measures applied to torture operations reveal the industrial mindset that governed these institutions. Supervisors conducted regular inspections of equipment to ensure proper maintenance and calibration. Operators underwent periodic evaluations to maintain their certification and identify areas for improvement. Facilities competed with each other for reputation and efficiency, leading to continuous refinement of techniques and procedures. The standardization of torture methods across different regions and jurisdictions shows the level of coordination that existed between medieval authorities. Operators trained in one facility could transfer their skills to installations anywhere in Europe. because the equipment, procedures, and documentation requirements were essentially identical. This interchangeability ensured that subjects couldn't escape professional interrogation by fleeing to different territories. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval torture was how completely it had been integrated into the normal functioning of society. Torture wasn't an aberration or an extreme measure used only in desperate circumstances. It was standard operating procedure for legal investigations, as routine and unremarkable as any other administrative function. Citizens expected that serious accusations would be investigated through torture, and many viewed the system as a necessary component of justice. The social acceptance of systematic torture reveals something profound about medieval attitudes toward human suffering and institutional authority. People who would never personally harm another human being could watch torture proceedings with the same detachment they brought to any other official ceremony. The systematic nature of the violence, the legal frameworks that governed it, and the professional competence of its operators created a sense of legitimacy that made horror seem normal. The psychological impact of living in a society where professional torture was routine extended far beyond those who actually experienced it. Everyone understood that accusations could lead to systematic mechanical destruction of the human body. This knowledge shaped behavior, speech, and social relationships in ways that created a climate of constant caution and fear. The mere existence of torture facilities exerted social control that was far more extensive than the actual application of torture. The record-keeping requirements meant that detailed documentation of torture sessions was preserved in legal archives across Europe. These records provide an unprecedented window into the systematic application of institutional violence, revealing not just the techniques used but the bureaucratic efficiency with which human suffering was organized and administered. The survival of this documentation is itself disturbing, showing how completely normalized torture had become in medieval administrative practice. The medical knowledge accumulated by professional torturers was remarkably advanced for its historical period. Operators understood human anatomy and physiology in ways that wouldn't be formally recognized by academic medicine for centuries. This knowledge was gained through practical experimentation on living subjects, creating a body of information about human pain tolerance and physical limits that was both extensive and precise. The techniques developed for maintaining subject consciousness during extreme physical stress were particularly sophisticated. Operators knew exactly how to regulate breathing, circulation, and nervous system function to keep subjects responsive throughout extended sessions. They understood which drugs could be used to enhance pain sensitivity while preventing loss of consciousness. Most disturbingly, they developed methods for accelerating recovery between sessions that allowed for repeated torture over extended periods. The psychological techniques used alongside physical torture were equally advanced. Operators understood how to manipulate hope and despair, how to create false sense of progress toward confession, and how to use family relationships and social connections as leverage for breaking resistance. They developed methods for reading body language and vocal stress that allowed them to calibrate psychological pressure with scientific precision. The documentation reveals that medieval torturers had identified specific personality types that required different approaches for effective breaking. They understood that intellectual subjects responded to logical arguments about the futility of resistance, while religious subjects needed theological justifications for confession. Warriors required challenges to their honor and courage, while merchants could be convinced through economic arguments about the costs of continued resistance. The long-term effects of rack torture on survivors were carefully studied and documented by medieval operators. They understood that subjects who experienced extreme stretching would suffer permanent joint damage, muscle weakness, and chronic pain that would serve as constant reminders of their interrogation. This knowledge was used to calibrate torture sessions to achieve desired confessions, while ensuring that survivors would be living advertisements for the consequences of resistance. The survival rates for rack torture were carefully tracked and used to refine techniques for maximum effectiveness. Operators knew that approximately 15% of subjects would die during or immediately after torture, regardless of the care taken to preserve life. This mortality rate was considered acceptable given the value of extracted confessions and the deterrent effect of public knowledge about torture procedures. The facilities developed sophisticated triage systems for managing multiple subjects simultaneously. Different torture devices were operated in parallel, with subjects moved between stations based on their resistance levels and physical condition. The most experienced operators handled the most difficult cases, while apprentices practiced on subjects who were expected to break quickly under minimal pressure. The coordination between torture facilities and other components of the medieval justice system was remarkably efficient. Court schedules were coordinated with torture availability to ensure that confessions could be extracted in time for legal proceedings. Transportation networks moved subjects between facilities based on specialized expertise or equipment requirements. Medical practitioners provided services designed to maintain subjects in condition for continued interrogation. The economic impact of torture operations on medieval societies was substantial and far-reaching. The direct costs of maintaining facilities, training operators, and purchasing equipment represented significant budget items for legal authorities. But the indirect costs were even greater, including the economic disruption caused by removing productive citizens from society and the resources devoted to investigating accusations that might have been resolved through other means. The social stratification of torture reveals how the system reinforced existing power structures while providing mechanisms for social control. Noble subjects received different treatment than commoners, with procedures modified to account for their social status and political connections. But even nobles weren't exempt from professional torture when accusations were serious enough to warrant investigation. The universality of torture across social classes created a form of equality in suffering that was unique in medieval society. The international aspects of medieval torture show how these techniques spread across political and cultural boundaries. Operators trained in one region would travel to share their expertise with colleagues in distant territories. Technical innovations developed in one facility would be adopted by installations across Europe. The exchange of knowledge and techniques created a professional community that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. But the true horror of medieval torture wasn't just its systematic nature or professional competence. It was how completely it succeeded in its primary purpose, creating a society where resistance to authority seemed impossible, and confession to any accusation appeared to be the only rational choice. The rack and its operators had achieved something that pure violence never could. They had created a system of social control so effective, so psychologically devastating, that it would influence human behavior for centuries beyond its actual use. The surviving testimony from those who lived through the rack reveals the final layer of horror in this systematic machine of human destruction. These weren't just broken bodies stumbling back into society. They were walking warnings, living advertisements for the consequences of resistance, carefully maintained as permanent reminders of what happened to those who challenged authority. The discharge procedures for rack survivors were as methodical as every other aspect of the torture system. Subjects weren't simply released and forgotten. They were processed through a deliberate reintegration protocol designed to maximize their value as deterrents while ensuring their continued usefulness to the authorities who had broken them. First came the medical assessment that determined how much permanent damage had been inflicted. Operators documented joint separations, muscle tears, nerve damage, and psychological trauma with the same clinical precision they applied during torture sessions. This wasn't compassionate healthcare. It was quality control evaluation, determining whether the torture had achieved its intended effects without causing so much damage that the subject would be useless as a witness to their own destruction. The psychological conditioning that followed was perhaps more devastating than the physical torture itself. Survivors were required to express gratitude for their treatment, to acknowledge the justice of their suffering, and to demonstrate their reformed character through public testimonials. Those who couldn't convincingly perform this theater of appreciation faced return visits to the torture chamber for additional attitude adjustment. But here's what makes the survivor management system truly chilling. The authorities understood that broken humans could be more valuable than dead ones. A corpse provided only temporary deterrent value. A living survivor, properly maintained and displayed, could serve as a permanent advertisement for the consequences of resistance. These walking warnings were strategically positioned throughout society to ensure maximum psychological impact on potential future subjects. The economic exploitation of survivors reveals the complete commodification of human suffering that characterized medieval torture operations. Broken subjects were often required to pay for their own torture, compensating the facility for the time, expertise, and equipment used in their interrogation. Those who couldn't afford immediate payment became indentured servants, working off their torture debts through years of unpaid labor. The testimonial requirements forced survivors to become active participants in the system that had destroyed them. They were required to appear at public ceremonies, describing their experiences in carefully scripted presentations that emphasized the professionalism of their treatment and the justice of their punishment. These performances weren't voluntary. They were mandatory theatrical productions where broken humans played themselves for audiences who needed to understand the consequences of challenging authority. The most disturbing aspect of survivor management was how it turned victims into recruiters for their own tormentors. Broken subjects were often required to identify others who might benefit from similar treatment, creating networks of informants who helped authorities locate new candidates for professional interrogation. The psychological damage was so complete that many survivors genuinely believed they were performing a public service by helping identify future subjects for torture. The medical maintenance of survivors was designed not to heal, but to preserve them in optimal condition for continued service as living warnings. Chronic pain was carefully managed to ensure it remained noticeable but not debilitating. Joint damage was treated to prevent complete disability while maintaining visible reminders of the torture experience. The goal was to create permanent invalids who could still function well enough to serve as effective deterrents. The social isolation imposed on survivors was systematic and complete. They were marked as different through clothing requirements, residential restrictions, and social protocols that ensured everyone understood their status as former torture subjects. This isolation served multiple purposes. It prevented them from organizing resistance, it amplified their psychological trauma, and it made their broken condition more visible to potential future subjects. The record-keeping that followed survivors throughout their remaining lives was as detailed as the documentation of their torture. Authorities tracked their movements, monitored their statements, and documented their physical and psychological condition through regular examinations. This surveillance wasn't just administrative thoroughness. It was ongoing psychological pressure that reminded survivors they could be returned to the torture chamber at any moment. The generational impact of torture survivors on their families and communities created ripple effects that extended the system's influence far beyond its immediate victims. Children grew up watching their broken parents struggle with chronic pain and psychological trauma. Spouses learned to recognize the signs of torture-induced disabilities. Communities developed social structures that accommodated the presence of walking reminders about the consequences of challenging authority. But perhaps the most devastating legacy of medieval torture wasn't the immediate suffering it caused, or even the social control it achieved. It was how completely it succeeded in convincing people that systematic human breaking was not only acceptable but necessary for social order. The professional competence of the operators, the legal frameworks that governed their work, and the bureaucratic efficiency of their institutions created a sense of legitimacy that made horror seem normal. The influence of medieval torture techniques on modern interrogation methods reveals how the principles discovered by rack operators continue to shape approaches to extracting information from unwilling subjects. The psychological techniques, the understanding of human breaking points, and the systematic application of pressure remain relevant to contemporary practitioners who face similar challenges in different contexts. We like to believe we've evolved beyond such systematic cruelty, that modern civilization has transcended the barbarism of our ancestors. But the documentation reveals that medieval torture wasn't primitive barbarism. It was sophisticated institutional violence conducted by trained professionals, using scientific methods and bureaucratic procedures that would be familiar to any modern organization. The rack and the systems surrounding it represent something more disturbing than random cruelty or historical brutality. They reveal how human societies can create institutions dedicated to systematic suffering and operate them with the same professional competence applied to any other administrative function. The normalization of horror, the bureaucratization of violence, and the scientific application of human breaking techniques show us capacities for organized evil that transcend historical periods and cultural boundaries. The next time you hear about torture in the modern world, remember that the techniques being used weren't invented yesterday. They're the refined descendants of methods perfected by medieval operators who understood human psychology and physiology better than most contemporary practitioners. The rack may be a museum piece, but the knowledge gained from its use continues to influence how humans break other humans in pursuit of power and control. The medieval torture system succeeded so completely in its objectives that its influence shaped social relationships for centuries beyond its actual use. The fear it created, the submission it demanded, and the broken humans it produced became permanent features of European society that persisted long after the last rack was dismantled and the final torture chamber was sealed. This is the gruesome truth that history textbooks don't teach and museums don't display. Medieval torture wasn't an aberration or an extreme measure used in desperate times. It was a sophisticated industry that operated with scientific precision and bureaucratic efficiency for over 6 centuries, creating a legacy of systematic human breaking that continues to influence how power operates in human societies today. The rack itself may be silent now, its wooden frame gathering dust in forgotten archives, or displayed as a curiosity for tourists who can't imagine the systematic horror it represents. But the knowledge gained from its use, the techniques perfected through its operation, and the understanding of human breaking points developed by its operators remain active forces in our world, hidden behind different terminology and modern justifications, but fundamentally unchanged in their purpose and effect. That's the most chilling realization of all. We haven't transcended the medieval capacity for systematic human breaking. We've simply refined it, bureaucratized it further, and convinced ourselves that our modern methods are somehow more civilized than the honest brutality of the rack. The truth is that the professional torturers of medieval Europe would recognize their intellectual descendants in the interrogation specialists of today, just as the broken survivors of rack torture would understand the psychological damage inflicted by contemporary techniques. The rack was never just a machine. It was a symbol of what humans can do to other humans when systematic violence becomes institutionalized, professionalized, and normalized. Its true horror lies not in its mechanical precision, but in how completely it succeeded in convincing both its operators and its society that breaking human beings was not only acceptable but necessary for civilization itself.